The dust swirled across the weathered platform of the Manassas, Colorado train station as Sarah Fairchild stepped down from the last car, her small valise clutched tightly in one trembling hand. The April sunshine of 1878 should have warmed her face, but she kept her head lowered, a curtain of honey blonde hair deliberately arranged to shield the left side of her face. Behind that veil of golden strands lay evidence of a past. She had fled a purpling bruise that encircled her eye like a macabre decoration. Quinn Calloway stood at the edge of the platform, hat in hand, scanning the descending passengers. His tall, lean frame was rigid with anticipation, boots shifting nervously on the wooden planks. He had been corresponding with Sarah Fairchild for nearly 8 months, exchanging letters that had grown increasingly personal and warm. The prospect of having a wife after 5 years of solitude on his ranch outside Manassas had kept him awake for the past 3 nights. When he spotted her thin, cautious, and moving with the wariness of a spooked deer his breath caught. She matched the small daguerreotype she had sent him, delicate features, a slight but strong build, and that unmistakable golden hair that caught the sunlight even through the dust of the rail yard. But something was wrong. Even from 20 paces, he could tell she was hiding her face. "Miss Fairchild," he called, his deep voice carrying over the hissing steam of the locomotive. Sarah's head jerked up involuntarily at the sound of her name, and for an instant, their eyes met his warm brown gaze colliding with her startled blue one. And the swollen, discolored flesh surrounding her left eye, Quinn's welcoming smile vanished. In 3 long strides he was before her, his weathered face a mask of concern and something darker, something that made Sarah instinctively take a step back. "Miss Fairchild," he said more softly now, "I'm Quinn Calloway." He made no move to touch her, seeming to understand her wariness without being told. "What happened to your eye?" Sarah's gloved hand flew to her face, an automatic gesture to hide the evidence, but it was too late. "It's nothing, Mr. Calloway. A simple accident during my journey. Perhaps we should proceed to—" "That's no accident," Quinn interrupted, his voice still gentle but now carrying an edge of steel. His eyes, warm just moments before, had gone cold as he studied the bruise. "Someone did that to you." "Who was it?" The directness of his question caught her off guard. In Boston, such matters were handled with delicate circumlocution if they were acknowledged at all. The raw concern in this stranger's voice, this man who was supposed to be her husband by week's end, made something twist painfully in her chest. "Mr. Calloway, please," she whispered, conscious of the curious glances from other passengers. "It doesn't matter now." "I'm here and it matters," he said firmly. His large, calloused hand hovered near her elbow but didn't touch. "Was it someone on the train? Or someone before you left?" Sarah swallowed hard, weighing her options. Her carefully constructed story about a fall on the train steps died on her lips when faced with Quinn Calloway's unwavering gaze. "My former employer's son," she admitted quietly. "Richard Harrington. I worked as a governess in his father's house in Boston. He took liberties I was unwilling to grant. When I refused him and announced my plans to come west, he became violent." Quinn's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the tanned skin. He was quiet for so long that Sarah began to fear she had said too much, that her revelation had destroyed whatever future they might have had before it even began. "Miss Fairchild," he finally said, his voice controlled but vibrating with something dangerous, "I apologize, but I have urgent business to attend to." Sarah's heart sank. "I understand if you wish to cancel our arrangement." "Cancel?" Quinn looked genuinely startled. "No, madam. That's not what I meant at all." He turned and signaled to an older man standing near the station house. "Hank, Come over here, will you?" An older gentleman with a silver-streaked beard hurried over. "This here is my neighbor, Hank Miller," Quinn explained. "He's going to escort you to my sister's place in town. Ruth will look after you for a few days." Sarah felt a flicker of confusion and, strangely, disappointment. "You're not taking me to your ranch today?" Quinn handed her valise to Hank before turning back to her. "I can't at present. As I said, I have urgent business." "In Boston?" Sarah asked, a chill running through her as she recognized the determined set of his jaw. Quinn settled his hat back on his head, his expression grim. "Seems I need to have a word with Richard Harrington about how to treat a lady." "Mr. Calloway, no." Sarah grabbed his arm, surprising them both with her boldness. "Boston is nearly 2,000 miles away. You can't possibly—" "I'll be back in 2 weeks, maybe 3, he said, as if he were merely riding to the next town over. "Ruth will see you're comfortable until then." "But this is madness. You don't even know me." Quinn's expression softened slightly as he looked down at her. "I know enough, Miss Fairchild. I know you've written me letters full of honesty and kindness for 8 months. I know you're brave enough to travel across the country to marry a man you've never met. And I know that no man has the right to mark a woman's face because she denies him." Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode away, his long legs carrying him quickly across the platform and down toward the livery stable at the end of Manassas Main Street. Sarah watched him go, torn between calling him back and letting him disappear into the dusty distance. "Don't you worry none, Miss Fairchild," Hank said kindly, picking up her valise. "Quinn Calloway's a man of his word. If he says he'll be back, then that's gospel truth." "But he can't simply ride to Boston," Sarah protested weakly. It's absurd." Hank chuckled. "Madam, if there's one thing you'll learn about Quinn Calloway, it's that can't isn't a word he recognizes. Now come along. Ruth's got fresh bread baking, and she's been tidying her spare room for 3 days waiting on you." As Hank led her toward a modest clapboard house 3 streets from the station, Sarah found herself continually looking back over her shoulder, but Quinn Calloway had vanished as swiftly as he'd appeared in her life. Ruth Calloway Miller turned out to be a petite woman with her brother's warm brown eyes, and a no-nonsense manner that somehow managed to be comforting rather than intimidating. When she saw Sarah's face, she merely pressed her lips together in a firm line, nodded once as if something had been confirmed, and said, "So that's why he tore out of here like the devil himself was on his heels." "I tried to stop him," Sarah said helplessly as Ruth showed her to a small but immaculate bedroom. "He doesn't even know me. Why would he do such a thing?" Ruth smiled, a warm expression that transformed her stern face. "Because he's Quinn. Always has been that way, even when we were children. Someone hurts something smaller or weaker, and Quinn can't rest until justice is served." She patted Sarah's hand. "Don't fret. He may not make it all the way to Boston, but he needed to do something. It's his nature." Over the next few days, Sarah settled into a strange limbo in Manassas. Ruth introduced her around town as Quinn's intended, a status that earned her curious looks, but also warm welcomes. The bruise around her eye faded from purple to a sickly yellow-green, less noticeable each day. Ruth kept her busy with household tasks and introductions to the small community, but every night, Sarah found herself wondering where Quinn Calloway was, how far he had traveled, and whether he would truly return. "Does your brother often do impulsive things like this?" she asked Ruth one evening as they sat on the porch, shelling peas into a large wooden bowl. Ruth considered the question. "I wouldn't call it impulsive, exactly. Quinn thinks things through, but once his mind's made up, there's no changing it. He's been alone too long, I think. After our parents died, he threw himself into building that ranch. It's a fine place now, but he's had no one to share it with. Until he advertised for a wife, Sarah murmured. Yes. Ruth gave her a searching look. I wondered about that decision, but when I saw those letters of yours he kept, I understood better. Sarah blushed. You read my letters, just glimpsed them. Quinn kept them tied with a ribbon in his desk drawer, handled them like they were made of spun glass. Ruth smiled at Sarah's deepening blush. Whatever you wrote clearly meant a great deal to him. I only wrote the truth, Sarah said softly, about my life, my hopes, what I wanted in a husband and a home. And what was that? Ruth asked, her nimble fingers never stopping their work on the peas. Sarah looked out at the darkening mountains beyond the small town. Kindness, she said finally, security, someone who would see me as a partner, not a possession. Her hand unconsciously rose to her healing eye. Someone who would never raise a hand in anger. Ruth nodded, understanding in her eyes. Then perhaps my brother's rash journey makes more sense than you think. As the days stretched into a week, then two, Sarah began to fear Quinn would not return. The skeptical glances from some of the townspeople didn't help. She overheard whispers in the general store speculation that Quinn had changed his mind about his mail-order bride once he'd seen her in person, or that he'd found another woman on his journey east. Nonsense, Ruth declared when Sarah tentatively shared these rumors. Quinn Calloway is many things, but he is not a man who breaks his word. Despite Ruth's confidence, by the beginning of the third week, Sarah's anxiety had grown to the point where she began to consider her options. She had enough money saved to perhaps secure a position in Denver, or even continue west to California. The thought left her hollow inside, but she refused to be a burden on Quinn's sister indefinitely. She was folding laundry on the back porch, mentally composing a letter to a teaching agency in Denver, when the sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. Looking up, she saw a rider approaching from the east, his form obscured by the dust kicked up by his horse. Ruth appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Company coming." "I'm not sure," Sarah replied, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. As the rider drew closer, Ruth let out a soft gasp. "It's Quinn." Sarah's heart leaped into her throat as she recognized the broad shoulders and straight-backed posture of the man she'd met so briefly at the train station. His clothes were travel-worn, his face darkened by sun and trail dust, but it was unmistakably Quinn Calloway. He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback, tethering his exhausted-looking mount to the porch rail. His eyes immediately sought and found Sarah, standing frozen with a sheet still clutched in her hands. "Miss Fairchild," he said, removing his hat. "I hope you've been comfortable with my sister." "Very comfortable, thank you," Sarah replied automatically, her mind spinning with questions. "Did you?" She stopped, unsure how to ask if he had actually traveled all the way to Boston, if he had confronted Richard, what had transpired. A ghost of a smile crossed Quinn's weary face. "We have much to discuss, but I'd appreciate a chance to wash the trail dust off first." He turned to his sister. "Ruth, is there hot water for a bath?" "I'll heat some right away," Ruth replied, giving Sarah a meaningful look before disappearing inside. Left alone with Quinn, Sarah found herself suddenly tongue-tied. This man had ridden off on an impossible quest on her behalf when she was little more than a stranger to him. What did one say in such a situation? "Your eye has healed well," Quinn observed, taking a step closer. His own right hand bore fresh scabs across the knuckles, she noticed. "Yes," she said, touching her face self-consciously. "The bruising is almost gone now." Quinn nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Good." He hesitated, then added, "If you've changed your mind about our arrangement during my absence, I would understand. My behavior was unorthodox." Sarah found herself smiling despite the tumult of emotions. That's certainly one word for it. Reckless and excessive also come to mind. A low chuckle escaped him, the sound warm and surprisingly boyish from such a serious man. Fair assessments. Did you really go all the way to Boston? She asked, finally voicing the question that had plagued her for weeks. Quinn's expression hardened slightly. I did. And Richard, Mr. Harrington and I had a discussion about his treatment of you. Quinn flexed his scraped knuckles unconsciously. I believe we came to an understanding. Sarah wasn't sure whether to be appalled or touched. You could have been killed or arrested. But I wasn't, he replied simply. Why? The question burst from her before she could stop it. Why would you do that for someone you barely know? Quinn took another step toward her, close enough now that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Because from your letters, I felt I did know you, Sarah Fairchild. I knew your spirit, your intelligence, your gentle heart. And when I saw what that man had done to you... He trailed off, jaw tightening. No one deserves that, especially not the woman I intend to marry. Sarah's breath caught. You still want to marry me, more than ever, he said quietly, if you'll still have me. Before she could answer, Ruth called from inside, announcing the bath water was heating. Quinn gave Sarah one last long look before heading inside, leaving her standing on the porch with her heart pounding and her thoughts in disarray. Later that evening, after Quinn had bathed and changed into clean clothes, the three of them sat down to dinner. Quinn recounted parts of his journey taking the train east as far as Chicago, then continuing to Boston, where he had indeed confronted Richard Harrington at his gentleman's club. I didn't kill him, if that's your concern, Quinn told Sarah, seeing her troubled expression. Though I'll admit the thought crossed my mind when he laughed about what he'd done to you. He laughed, Sarah whispered, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. Quinn's expression darkened. Not for long. Quinn, Ruth admonished, though there was little real reproach in her tone. I merely explained to Mr. Harrington and his friends that out west, a man who strikes a woman is considered the lowest form of coward, Quinn continued. And that if he ever attempted to contact you again, I would return with a more permanent solution to his behavior problem. Sarah shook her head in wonder. And they just let you walk away after threatening him? A wry smile crossed Quinn's face. Let's just say Mr. Harrington's friends were suddenly very eager to distance themselves from him once they learned what he'd done. Apparently, even in Boston, certain lines shouldn't be crossed. After dinner, Ruth made a transparent excuse about needing to visit a neighbor, leaving Quinn and Sarah alone in the small parlor. For a moment, they sat in awkward silence, the weight of all that had happened and all that remained unsaid hanging between them. I brought you something, Quinn said finally, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and string, offering it to her with an almost shy gesture. Sarah accepted it, their fingers brushing momentarily. She untied the string carefully and folded back the paper to reveal a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. It's beautiful, she breathed, opening the small clasp to find it empty inside. I thought, perhaps someday it might hold miniatures. Of our family, Quinn said, a faint flush creeping up his neck. If you decide to accept my proposal, that is. Sarah looked up from the locket to study his face, the strong jaw, the earnest eyes, the quiet strength evident in every line. This man had traveled across the country to defend her honor when no one else in her life had ever stood up for her. Yet here he sat, uncertain of her answer. Mr. Calloway, Quinn, he corrected gently. If we're to be married, you should use my given name. Quinn, she amended, the name feeling both strange and right on her lips. What you did was reckless, impulsive, and possibly the most chivalrous thing anyone has ever done for me. A cautious smile touched his lips. "Is that a yes?" I think we should properly court for at least a few weeks before making such a momentous decision," Sarah replied, though she couldn't keep an answering smile from her own face. "I'd like to get to know the man behind the letters in person." Quinn nodded, respect evident in his expression. "That seems reasonable, though I should warn you I'm not nearly as eloquent in person as I am on paper." "Neither am I," Sarah admitted, "but I'd like the chance to try." Over the next 2 weeks, Quinn courted Sarah with a careful blend of attentiveness and respect. He showed her around Manassas, introduced her to neighbors and friends, and in the evenings, they would sit on Ruth's porch and talk until the stars emerged in the clear Colorado sky. Sarah learned that Quinn had built his ranch from nothing after his parents died in a flash flood 10 years earlier. With Ruth safely married to the town's blacksmith, Quinn had poured his grief and energy into transforming the small plot of land his father had purchased into a thriving cattle operation. "It's a good life," he told her as they rode in his wagon out to see the ranch for the first time. "But a lonely one." The ranch took Sarah's breath away not because of its grandeur, but because of its evident care. The main house was modest but solid, built of local timber with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Corrals and outbuildings were meticulously maintained, and the snow-capped mountains formed a magnificent backdrop to the entire scene. "It's beautiful," she said honestly as Quinn helped her down from the wagon. "It needs a woman's touch," he replied, watching her face carefully. "The inside is plain, but there's room for whatever changes you might want to make, if—" he hesitated, "if you decide to stay." As Quinn showed her through the house, Sarah could see the evidence of a solitary life: functional furniture, sparse decorations, clean but stark rooms waiting for someone to transform them into a home. The kitchen was large and well-equipped, with a view of the garden that made Sarah immediately envision herb beds and flowers. "There's a good library," Quinn said almost apologetically, opening a door to reveal a room lined with bookshelves. "I remember you wrote about your love of reading." Sarah stepped into the room amazed. "You have so many books." "My mother was a schoolteacher before she married my father," he explained. "Reading was important to her, to me too." They spent hours at the ranch that day, with Quinn showing Sarah every aspect of the operation. She met his ranch hands, 3 weathered men who tipped their hats respectfully, and tried unsuccessfully to hide their curiosity about the woman their boss had ridden to Boston for. As they rode back to town in the golden light of late afternoon, Sarah felt a growing certainty in her heart. The man beside her, solid and steady as the mountains surrounding them, was exactly who his letters had promised him to be, and perhaps even more. "Quinn," she said as the wagon rolled down the main street of Manassas, "I don't think I need the full courtship period after all." He glanced at her, hope and wariness mingling in his expression. "What are you saying, Sarah?" "I'm saying yes," she replied simply. "I would be honored to be your wife." The joy that transformed Quinn's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Without a word, he pulled the wagon to a halt, set the brake, and turned to her. His hand, rough with work but infinitely gentle, came up to cup her cheek. "May I?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. When Sarah nodded, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that started tender but quickly deepened with a passion that surprised them both. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard, and Quinn's eyes had darkened to the color of rich earth after rain. "I should get you back to Ruth's before I forget myself entirely," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Sarah laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Yes, I suppose that would be best. We should at least wait until after the wedding." They were married 3 days later in Manassas's small church, with Ruth and her husband standing as witnesses. Sarah wore a simple blue dress that Ruth had helped her alter, and Quinn looked almost uncomfortable in his best suit, though the discomfort vanished from his expression the moment Sarah appeared at the back of the church. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Quinn's kiss was both reverent and promising. The small gathering of townspeople who had come to witness the wedding cheered as they walked back down the aisle together. The wedding supper at Ruth's house was a joyful affair, with neighbors bringing dishes and offering good wishes. As evening fell, Quinn led his new wife out to the wagon that would take them to their home now. Sarah realized with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. The ranch house was transformed when they arrived. Lanterns glowed in the windows, and when Quinn carried Sarah across the threshold, despite her laughing protests that she was perfectly capable of walking, she gasped at the changes. Vases of wildflowers stood on every surface, and a fire crackled welcomingly in the stone hearth of the main room. "The hands must have done this," Quinn said, looking as surprised as she was. "Martinez's wife probably helped. She has a good eye for such things." "It's wonderful," Sarah said, taking in the warm, inviting atmosphere that had been created for their return. That night, as husband and wife, they discovered each other with tender care and growing passion. Quinn's hands, so strong yet so gentle, mapped every inch of her skin as if committing her to memory. Sarah found herself bolder than she had ever imagined being, drawing sounds of pleasure from her husband that made her feel powerful and cherished all at once. Afterward, lying in his arms with the moonlight spilling through the bedroom window, Sarah traced the scar that ran along his ribs, evidence of a life lived on the frontier. "What really happened in Boston?" she asked quietly. "The full story, not the version you told at dinner." Quinn was silent for a long moment, his hand continuing its gentle stroking of her hair. "I found him at his club, like I said. He was with friends, drinking and laughing. When I asked if he was Richard Harrington, he looked me up and down like I was something he'd scraped off his boot." Sarah could picture the scene all too clearly: Richard's aristocratic disdain, Quinn's quiet, dangerous presence. "I told him I was your husband," Quinn continued, "which wasn't true yet, but it got his attention. When I mentioned what he'd done to you, he laughed and said you'd probably deserved it for being an ungrateful." He stopped. "Well, his words don't bear repeating." "And then," Sarah prompted, feeling Quinn's heartbeat quicken beneath her cheek. "Then I invited him to step outside and repeat those sentiments where we could discuss them properly. His friends tried to have me thrown out, but I made it clear I wasn't leaving until Mr. Harrington and I had our conversation. So he came outside." Quinn's laugh held little humor. "Not willingly, but I can be persuasive." Sarah lifted her head to look at her husband's face. "Quinn Calloway, did you drag Richard Harrington out of his gentleman's club?" "Let's just say I helped him recognize the importance of our discussion," Quinn replied diplomatically. "Once outside, I explained exactly what happens to men who strike women where I come from. He didn't take the lesson well at first." "Thus the scraped knuckles," Sarah murmured, taking his hand and pressing a kiss to the healing cuts. "He had a surprisingly hard jaw for such a soft man," Quinn admitted. "But after the second time I put him on the ground, he seemed more receptive to my educational efforts. And his friends stood back and watched. A few actually applauded when I was done." Quinn's expression grew serious. "Before I left him there in that alley, I made sure he understood that you were under my protection now, and that if he ever tried to contact you or harm you again, our next meeting would end very differently." Sarah laid her head back on Quinn's chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. "You could have been killed," she whispered. "So could you staying with people like that," he replied simply. "Some risks are worth taking." In the days that followed, Sarah began the process of making the ranch house truly her home. Quinn gave her free rein to change whatever she wished, though she found herself appreciating the solid craftsmanship of the furniture he had built and the logical organization of the household. She added touches of color with curtains and cushions purchased from the general store, planted an herb garden outside the kitchen window, and arranged her small collection of books alongside Quinn's more extensive library. Life on the ranch followed the rhythm of the seasons and the needs of the cattle. Quinn worked from dawn until dusk most days, but always made time to share meals with Sarah and spend evenings with her. She learned to make soap from rendered fat and lye, to preserve fruits and vegetables for the winter months, and to shoot the rifle Quinn insisted she know how to handle, just in case. For his part, Quinn found himself wondering how he had ever lived without Sarah's presence. Her laughter filled the house that had been silent for too long, and her practical intelligence impressed him daily. She quickly won over the ranch hands with her excellent cooking and genuine interest in their work, and even the most weathered of them tipped their hats respectfully when she approached. "Mrs. Calloway," Martinez said one evening when he came to the house to discuss a problem with the north pasture fence. "The boss hasn't stopped smiling since you arrived. It's unsettling the cattle." Sarah laughed as Quinn pretended to scowl. "I'll try to make him more disagreeable, Mr. Martinez, but I can't promise results." "Don't you dare," Quinn said after Martinez had gone. "I've had enough disagreeableness to last a lifetime." As summer turned to fall, and the aspen trees on the mountainsides transformed into sheets of gold, Sarah began to suspect a change in her own body. Her monthly courses, regular as clockwork since she was 16, failed to appear. Her dresses grew slightly tighter around the waist, and certain smells, particularly the coffee Quinn was so fond of, suddenly turned her stomach. She kept her suspicions to herself for several weeks, not wanting to raise Quinn's hopes until she was certain. But when she found herself weeping over a dropped plate one afternoon, she knew the time had come to share her news. That evening, after dinner, she took Quinn's hand and led him to the porch swing he had built for her earlier in the summer. As they sat together watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold, she gathered her courage. "Quinn," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I believe I'm going to have a baby." Quinn went perfectly still beside her, his hand tightening almost painfully around hers before he consciously relaxed it. "A baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor's confirmation," she replied. "All the signs are there." In one swift movement, Quinn slid from the swing to kneel before her, his hands cradling her still flat abdomen with a reverence that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "A baby," he said again, wonder filling his voice. He looked up at her, his brown eyes swimming with emotion. "Thank you." "I had some help in the matter," Sarah teased gently, running her fingers through his dark hair. Quinn laughed, pressing his forehead against her knees. "When will it come?" "Sometime in late March, I believe." "Spring," Quinn said, nodding as if this made perfect sense. "New life when the land wakes up." He rose to sit beside her again, pulling her close against his side. "We should ride to town tomorrow, have Doc Wilson confirm it." Sarah nestled against her husband's solid warmth. "And then we should tell Ruth. She'll be beside herself." "She'll insist on moving in for the last month," Quinn predicted with a chuckle. "Fair warning." The doctor confirmed Sarah's pregnancy the next day, and Ruth was indeed ecstatic at the news of an impending niece or nephew. As autumn deepened into winter, Sarah's body changed, the gentle swell of her abdomen becoming more pronounced. Quinn watched these changes with a mixture of awe and concern, insisting on taking over the heavier household chores despite Sarah's protests that she wasn't an invalid. "Humor me," he would say, kissing her forehead. "It makes me feel useful." The winter of 1878–1879 was harsh, with blizzards sweeping down from the mountains and temperatures plummeting so low that the creek behind the house froze solid. Quinn worried about keeping the house warm enough for Sarah and their unborn child, but the sturdy logs and well-constructed fireplace proved equal to the task. On the coldest nights, they would lie tangled together beneath layers of quilts, Quinn's hand resting protectively over the growing mound of Sarah's belly. Sometimes they would feel the baby move a flutter at first, then stronger kicks as the weeks passed. "He's going to be a fighter," Quinn said proudly after a particularly energetic session of kicks. "Or she," Sarah reminded him. "It could be a girl." Quinn smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "A girl with golden hair like her mother would be the greatest blessing I could imagine." As March approached, preparations for the baby intensified. Quinn converted a small room adjacent to their bedroom into a nursery, crafting a cradle from pine with his own hands. Sarah sewed tiny garments from soft flannel, and Ruth sent over a beautiful hand-pieced quilt she had been working on since hearing the news. The baby, however, had plans of its own. On a clear, cold night in late February, Sarah woke to a sharp pain and a rush of wetness between her thighs. "Quinn," she gasped, shaking her sleeping husband. "The baby's coming." Quinn was instantly alert, years of responding to nighttime emergencies on the ranch serving him well. He helped Sarah change into a dry nightgown, built up the fire, and prepared to ride for the doctor and the midwife in town. "I don't want to leave you," he said, his face taut with concern as another pain made Sarah gasp. "You must," she managed once the contraction passed. "I need help with this, but hurry." The ride to town and back was the longest journey of Quinn's life, though he pushed his horse to its limits through the moonlit night. By the time he returned with both the doctor and Mrs. Perez, the local midwife, Sarah's pains were coming regularly and with increasing intensity. "Good timing, Mr. Calloway," Dr. Wilson said as they hurried into the bedroom where Sarah lay, her face flushed and hair damp with sweat. "Now, unless you have medical training I'm unaware of, I suggest you wait in the other room." Quinn looked ready to argue until Sarah reached for his hand. "It's all right," she assured him. "I'm in good hands, but perhaps you could bring some more hot water." This task, at least, gave him something useful to do. For the next several hours, Quinn paced the main room of the house, wincing at each cry that came from behind the closed bedroom door. He prayed as he had never prayed before, not for a son, as he had once hoped, but simply for Sarah and the baby to survive this ordeal that women had faced since the beginning of time. Just as dawn was breaking over the eastern plains, a new cry pierced the air, thin, outraged, and gloriously alive. Quinn froze in his pacing, his heart seeming to stop and then restart at double speed. The bedroom door opened, and Dr. Wilson emerged, looking tired but satisfied. "Congratulations, Mr. Calloway," he said, clapping Quinn on the shoulder. "You have a fine, healthy son." Quinn swayed slightly on his feet. "And Sarah, tired but well. She's a strong woman, your wife." The doctor stepped aside, and Quinn moved past him as if in a dream, entering the bedroom where Mrs. Perez was just finishing tidying up. Sarah lay propped against the pillows, her face pale but radiant with a joy Quinn had never seen before. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in the quilt Ruth had made. "Quinn," she said softly, looking up as he approached, "come meet your son." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, feeling as though his legs might not support him much longer. Sarah tilted the bundle toward him, revealing a tiny, red face with a shock of dark hair. His hair, Quinn realized with a sense of wonder. "He's perfect," Quinn whispered, reaching out to touch one miniature hand. The baby reflexively gripped his father's finger, and Quinn felt something break open inside his chest, a love so overwhelming it almost hurt. "Would you like to hold him?" Sarah asked. With more fear than he'd ever felt facing down a stampeding herd, Quinn carefully took the swaddled infant from his wife's arms. The baby weighed almost nothing, yet seemed to contain the entire world in his small form. "Hello, son," Quinn said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm your pa." The baby's eyes, unfocused and dark blue, seemed to look directly at him for a moment before closing in sleep. Quinn looked up at Sarah, unable to find words to express what he was feeling. "What shall we name him?" she asked, understanding his silence. They had discussed names during the winter evenings but had never settled on a final choice. Now, looking at his son's face, Quinn knew. "Samuel," he said, "after your father." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. "Samuel Quinn Calloway," she agreed. "A good, strong name, Mrs." Perez slipped out of the room, leaving the new family alone together. Quinn shifted carefully on the bed until he was sitting next to Sarah, their son cradled between them. "Thank you," he said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "For coming west, for taking a chance on a stranger, for this miracle." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder. "Thank you for defending my honor when no one else would, for seeing value in me when I'd almost forgotten it myself." They sat together as the morning light strengthened, illuminating the room where their family had just increased by one precious life. Outside, the world was beginning to thaw, the first hints of spring appearing in the lengthening days, and the occasional brave crocus pushing through the snow. "I never imagined this," Sarah admitted quietly. "When I stepped off that train with my bruised face and shattered confidence, I thought the best I could hope for was security and basic kindness. I never dreamed of such happiness." Quinn's arm tightened around her shoulders. "When I rode out that day, all I could think about was making someone pay for hurting you. I never imagined I'd come back to find my whole life transformed." He looked down at their sleeping son. "For the better, in every possible way." As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, the Calloway ranch prospered alongside him. Quinn's careful management and Sarah's skillful running of the household allowed them to expand their holdings, purchasing additional acreage and increasing their herd. By Samuel's third birthday, they had one of the most successful operations in the county. The arrival of their daughter, Eliza Ruth, when Samuel was 4, only added to their joy. With her mother's golden hair and her father's determined personality, she quickly had both parents and her older brother wrapped around her tiny finger. "She's going to be a handful," Quinn predicted as they watched 6-month-old Eliza determinedly pulling herself up on furniture, eager to chase after her brother. "Like someone else I know," Sarah replied with a meaningful look at her husband. Quinn laughed and pulled her close. "Guilty as charged." On a warm summer evening in 1885, 7 years after Sarah had first stepped off the train in Manassas, the Calloway family sat on their expanded porch, watching fireflies rise from the meadow as the day's heat gave way to the cool mountain night. Samuel, now 6 and full of energy, chased the glowing insects while Quinn kept a watchful eye on him. Eliza, not quite 2, dozed in Sarah's arms, her cherubic face peaceful in sleep. "You ever think about him?" Quinn asked suddenly. "Harrington." Sarah looked surprised by the question. In all their years together, they rarely spoke of her former life or the man who had marked her face and inadvertently set her on the path to Quinn. "No," she said honestly. "Not in years." Quinn nodded, seeming satisfied with her answer. "Good. Do you?" Sarah asked curiously. Quinn watched his son leap high, trying to capture a particularly bright firefly. Sometimes, not often. He turned to look at his wife, his eyes soft in the gathering dusk. I think about how strange life is, how one man's cruelty led me to the greatest blessings of my life. Not his cruelty, Sarah corrected gently. Your response to it. That made all the difference. Quinn reached over to tuck a strand of hair behind his wife's ear, his fingers lingering on the spot where the bruise had once been. Now there was only smooth skin, tanned by years of Colorado sun and creased at the corners of her eyes from smiling. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I hadn't ridden out that day, he admitted. If I had just taken you to the ranch as planned. Sarah shifted Eliza to her other arm, considering the question. I think we would have found our way to this same place eventually, she said. But that journey showed me exactly who you were, Quinn Calloway. It told me everything I needed to know about the man I was marrying. And what was that? He asked, a smile playing around his lips. That you were a man who would ride 2,000 miles to right a wrong, that you would defend those who couldn't defend themselves, that your sense of justice was as strong as your sense of love. Sarah leaned over to kiss him softly. That you were exactly the man your letters promised you would be. Samuel came running back to the porch, his hands cupped around a captured firefly. Look, Pa, I caught the biggest one. Quinn lifted his son onto his lap, examining the glowing insect. That's a fine one, son. Remember what we talked about, though. Samuel nodded solemnly. We have to let it go because it needs to be free. That's right, Quinn agreed. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is set something free. They watched as Samuel carefully opened his hands, allowing the firefly to rise into the darkening sky. It hovered for a moment, as if in gratitude, before joining its fellows in their silent, luminous dance across the meadow. Sarah looked at her husband and children, at the home they had built together, at the land that had sustained them through seasons of plenty and scarcity. 7 years ago, she had arrived in Manassas bruised and frightened, putting her fate in the hands of a stranger. Now, sitting on the porch of the home they had created, surrounded by the family they had made, she knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true place in the world. I love you, Quinn Calloway, she said simply. Quinn's smile was as warm as the day they had met. And I love you, Sarah Calloway. Yesterday, today, and all our tomorrows. As the stars emerged above the mountains and their children nestled against them in the peaceful evening, Sarah knew those tomorrows stretched before them like an endless promise, a future built on courage, justice, and a love that had begun with a bruise, a question, and the sound of hoofbeats disappearing into the distance on a fateful spring day in Manassas, Colorado.